Pacific, 1944. The sea is calm, the sky is blue. But beneath that stillness lies a race against time. The Japanese believe they can stop America with island fortresses and the spirit of death before surrender. The Americans answer with something the world has never seen, the weapon of speed. Men in uniform, their hands not on rifles but on bulldozer controls. They call themselves the Seabees. Their creed, we build, we fight. Land today, runway tomorrow. 20 days to turn coral, mud and craters into a strip long enough for the B-29 to rise. If they're one day late, Marines die on the beaches, fleets burn under kamikazes, and the sky remains Japanese. But if they finish in time, Tokyo comes within reach. This is not the story of guns and glory. It's the moment when industry defeated will, when every sheet of steel laid was 1 mile closer to the enemy's heart. And in those 20 short days, Japan realized they were fighting not just an army, but a civilization. The Pacific Ocean, a vast expanse of blue stretching beyond the horizon, calm on the surface, merciless beneath. In 1942, it was no longer a paradise of islands and waves. It had become a chessboard of steel and blood. On one side stood the Empire of Japan, proud, disciplined, intoxicated by victory. On the other, the United States, humiliated but awakening. Two civilizations, two philosophies about to collide in a war that would redefine what it meant to fight. The Japanese had moved fast, sweeping across the Pacific like a storm. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya. One after another fell. Every island became a fortress, ringed with coral reefs, pillboxes, and airstrips. Every stretch of jungle turned into another bastion of the emperor's defense. From Tokyo's view, their line was unbreakable, a wall of islands stretching thousands of miles. A wall that would bleed America white before it could ever reach Japan. But the Americans were learning. For them, survival now meant something new, not to fight harder, but to build faster. After Pearl Harbor, America's industrial power ignited like a machine roaring to life. Factories ran without pause. Shipyards glowed through the night. But the problem wasn't what to build, it was where to build. The Pacific was unlike Europe. No railroads, no ports, no cities, only tiny islands, fragments of coral, jungle, and volcanic rock. Each battle wasn't just a fight for territory, it was a fight for a place to land. Every successful landing had to become an instant base, a runway, a dock, a hospital, a fortress. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood it before anyone else. You can't fight across the Pacific unless you can build across it. Every foot of concrete, every plank of steel was another mile toward Tokyo. Before 1942, military construction was done by civilian contractors. They built roads, harbors, depots, far behind the front lines. But in the Pacific, there were no safe zones. Every construction site was a battlefield. If civilians picked up weapons, they could be executed as guerrillas under international law. So the U.S. Navy made a radical decision: build a construction force that could fight. Rear Admiral Ben Morial, a visionary engineer, led the charge. His idea was revolutionary. Merge the builder and the warrior. Men who could wield both hammer and rifle. Men who could land with Marines, build under fire, and defend their work. Thus, the Naval Construction Battalions were born. Their name shortened into 2 letters, Seabees, but sailors had another name for them, Seabees. The Seabees were not kids. They weren't drafted teenagers. They were veterans of construction, welders, miners, machinists, men who had built America itself. They were in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. They'd worked through the Great Depression. They'd poured concrete for skyscrapers, laid steel for bridges, tunneled through mountains. Now they wore Navy uniforms, carried rifles, and swore an oath not only to fight, but to build. Their training was brutal. They learned to fire rifles, dig foxholes, set explosives, and then, in the same day, operate bulldozers, graders, and cranes under simulated bombardment. They became something new in military history. Armed engineers who could land with the first wave and build a base before the second. Their motto was carved into their souls. Construimus, batuimus, we build, we fight. Their first real test came at Guadalcanal, August 1942. U.S. Marines stormed ashore and captured a half-finished Japanese airfield, Henderson Field. The Japanese wanted it back, desperately. They threw everything they had at the island: bombers, destroyers, battleships. Night after night, the sky burned red. The Seabees arrived in September, 387 men of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion. Their task: make Henderson Field operational. Their reality: they were building in hell. Japanese shells cratered the runway daily. Every time it was repaired, another barrage came. On October 13th, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, fired 900 shells into the airfield. By dawn, the Seabees had filled every crater. At sunrise, American fighters roared off the strip again. A Marine pilot later said, "If not for those builders, we'd have been wiped off that island." It was here that Japan realized what it was facing. A nation that built as fast as it fought. To the Japanese, construction was a matter of manpower. To the Americans, it was a matter of machines. A Japanese construction unit used shovels, picks, and human chains. A Seabee unit used bulldozers, steamrollers, and cranes. A single D8 bulldozer could move more earth in an hour than 300 men with shovels could move in a day. At Guadalcanal, the difference became lethal. When Japanese guns tore holes in a Henderson Field, the Seabees patched them faster than they could fire. To Tokyo, it seemed impossible. To Washington, it was the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Logistics as a weapon. A small island in the New Hebrides, Espiritu Santo, dense jungle, swamps, mosquitoes thick as smoke. In July, 387 Seabees landed with 6 tractors and 2 scrapers. 20 days later, a 6,000-foot airstrip stood where jungle once was. Japanese intelligence learned of it weeks later. Their doctrine stated such construction should take months, perhaps years. Instead, the Americans had done it with a handful of machines and men. To Japanese planners, this wasn't engineering, it was sorcery. To the Seabees, it was just another job done. Each island became a deadline. Tarawa, Makin, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam. Each one was a battle measured in feet of concrete, not just casualties. The pattern was always the same. Marines landed. Seabees followed, often while fighting still raged. They cleared wreckage, filled bomb craters, laid steel matting for runways. At Tarawa, the first airstrip was operational within 15 hours of the last gunshot. 15 hours, faster than the Japanese had ever believed possible. A captured officer later confessed, "We thought it was madness until we saw the planes taking off." The Seabees worked under constant threat. Snipers, bombers, artillery. They built while the enemy still fired from the tree line. At Saipan, a bulldozer operator kept clearing coral even as shells exploded nearby. He refused to stop, because every hour mattered and every crater meant delay. When his dozer was hit, another man climbed in and kept going. By nightfall, the runway extended another 300 feet. They weren't soldiers seeking glory. They were workers whose tool was endurance. In 1943, Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur began planning the next phase. They knew Japan's empire couldn't be broken head-on. Instead, America would leapfrog, bypassing strongholds, seizing weaker islands, and turning them into airfields overnight. Every time an island fell, Japanese planners assumed the Americans would take months to build a base. They planned counterattacks accordingly. But within days, B-24 bombers were already launching from new runways. By the time Japan prepared to strike back, the Americans had already moved on to the next island. Speed had become the new weapon of war. The Seabees didn't work alone. Behind them was a continent. In the U.S., factories built bulldozers, cranes, trucks, and steel mats around the clock. Each island campaign consumed thousands of tons of equipment. Ships carried prefabricated hangars, piers, hospitals, and barracks. Ready to assemble like Lego under fire, a Japanese officer who witnessed it said, "It was like watching an entire nation arrive on our beaches." That was the truth. America had turned war into mass production, and the Seabees were the assembly line at the front. Despite the conditions, heat, exhaustion, death, the Seabees kept a sense of humor. They painted cartoon bees with sailor caps on their equipment. They played harmonicas in the mud. Their motto spread through the Pacific: "The difficult we do at once. The impossible takes a little longer." That phrase wasn't arrogance. It was survival. Because in the Pacific, a delay could kill thousands. June 1944. The battle for Saipan raged for weeks. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. When the shooting stopped, the Seabees moved in and turned ruin into runway. Within 20 days, Aslito Airfield was expanded to handle B-29 superfortresses, massive bombers that could fly all the way to Tokyo. A few months later, those bombers took off, and Japan felt the first direct strikes on its homeland since the war began. A Marine officer later wrote, "The Seabees gave us airfields. The airfields gave us victory." Captured documents after the war revealed something chilling. Japanese planners had completely underestimated U.S. capability. They believed the Americans could launch one major operation every 6 months. In reality, by 1944, they were launching one every 6 weeks. They believed the Pacific would protect them. Instead, the ocean had become an American highway, paved by the Seabees. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome later admitted, "Our entire defensive concept was broken by the enemy's ability to construct bases faster than we could destroy them." It wasn't superior numbers that doomed Japan. It was superior organization. The Seabees paid dearly for their speed. They worked through disease, exhaustion, and endless shell fire. Some were buried beneath collapsing trenches. Others died repairing roads hit by artillery. But their losses were silent, rarely recorded, rarely honored. They didn't fight to kill, they fought to build. When the war ended, many went home quietly, their names forgotten, their work left behind. But their runway still stood. Looking back, the Seabees represented something larger than the Navy. They embodied the soul of America's industrial civilization. Every bulldozer, every crane, every sheet of steel was a fragment of that civilization made visible. The Japanese had believed war was about courage. The Americans proved it was about systems, machines, logistics, manpower, and motion. The Pacific War wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of centuries. The feudal past versus the industrial future. The 6,000-foot runway built in 20 days became a legend, not because it was fast, but because it symbolized a new kind of war. A war fought by men who built instead of destroyed. A war where victory came from creation, not annihilation. In the words of Admiral Nimitz, without the Seabees, the Pacific campaign would have taken years longer, if it succeeded at all. Their story is not one of glory, but of grit. Of ordinary men with extraordinary endurance. By the end of 1944, America had advanced across thousands of miles. From Guadalcanal to the Marianas, from jungle to coral, from mud to concrete. The Seabees had built more than 100 airfields, 700 docks, and 400 bases. But the hardest tests were yet to come. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, where the enemy would no longer retreat and every inch of soil would demand blood for concrete. The Pacific had become a forge, and inside it, the Seabees had become steel. Summer 1944, Across the vastness of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the ocean glimmered a deceptive blue. Beneath that calm surface lay the next phase of America's advance toward Japan. For Tokyo, these islands were sacred ground, the final barrier protecting the homeland. For Washington, they were stepping stones across the Pacific. And for the men of the Seabees, they were construction sites waiting under fire. When the first waves of Marines hit Saipan's beaches, the sea turned red. Japanese machine guns tore through the surf. Flames rose from the transport ships offshore. But even as the Marines fought to establish a foothold, the Seabees landing craft waited just behind them, loaded with bulldozers, cranes, and trucks instead of guns. The Japanese defenders didn't understand what they were seeing. The Americans weren't just bringing soldiers. They were bringing a construction industry. The invasion of Saipan, June 15, 1944, was one of the bloodiest landings of the Pacific War. Japanese coastal guns hammered the beaches. Air raids from nearby Tinian strafed the waves. But amid the chaos, the Seabees pushed ashore. They didn't wait for the front lines to be secured. As soon as the Marines cleared a few hundred yards of beach, the bulldozers rolled in, under fire. A veteran of the 121st Construction Battalion recalled, "We drove off the landing craft and straight into machine gun fire. Shells were falling all around us, but we couldn't stop. If we stopped, the next ship couldn't unload." By the end of the second day, the Seabees had carved out a rough road through sand and wreckage, allowing trucks and ambulances to move inland. When night fell, the Marines dug in, and the Seabees, working by lantern light, began surveying the site for a new airfield. 4 days later, the Marines captured Aslito Airfield, a battered Japanese installation on Saipan's southern tip. The Japanese had left it cratered and mined. Useless, they thought, to the Americans. But to the Seabees, it was a treasure. Over 1,000 construction men from battalions 121 and 18 poured into the ruins. They cleared wreckage, filled shell holes, and detonated unexploded bombs. They blasted coral to expand the runway and crushed volcanic rock to make fill. The work never stopped, 3 shifts a day around the clock. Men ate while operating bulldozers. They slept beside their machines. On the 20th day, a P-47 Thunderbolt lifted off from the new runway. The dust rose behind it like a wave. The impossible had been done. In less than 3 weeks, the Americans had transformed a shattered battlefield into a functional air base capable of launching heavy bombers. Tokyo's intelligence officers were stunned. Their reports had estimated 3 months for such a task. They were wrong, by more than 70 days. One Japanese officer later admitted, "We had calculated the time of war by men and shovels. They calculated it by machines and hours." Marines who fought alongside the Seabees remembered their relentless drive. One sergeant wrote, "Those guys worked through anything. Shells, snipers, air raids, it didn't matter. When we took cover, they kept going." To the Japanese, these men seemed inhuman. Machine warriors, they called them. To the Americans, they were simply the men who made victory possible. Each Seabee unit carried a small arsenal: rifles, BARs, machine guns. And when the enemy broke through the perimeter, the builders became soldiers. At Saipan, a group of Seabees defended their construction zone, with machine guns mounted on bulldozers fighting off a night assault until dawn. By morning, they were back to grading the runway, their dozers still warm from combat. When Tokyo received reconnaissance photos of Saipan 20 days after the invasion, the high command refused to believe them. The images showed rows of bombers parked on an island that had supposedly been under siege just weeks earlier. One intelligence officer remarked bitterly, "If this is true, then Japan is already lost." And he was right, because those airfields, Saipan, Tinian, and later Guam, placed the Japanese homeland within range of the new B-29 superfortress. It was the moment Japan's outer defense line ceased to matter. The enemy was now within reach of Tokyo itself. Just 6 miles from Saipan lay Tinian, an island of coral plains and coconut groves. Perfect terrain for runways. For the Americans, it was the next logical step. For the Japanese, it was the last stand before the home islands. On July 24, 1944, the Marines landed again. Artillery thundered across the beaches as bulldozers followed closely behind. Within hours, Seabees from the 6th and 18th Battalions were unloading equipment, blasting through coral ridges, grading earth, and laying steel matting. They worked 24 hours a day, fighting exhaustion, malaria, and sniper fire. In just 2 months, they completed 4 parallel runways, each 8,500 feet long, the largest airfield complex in the world at that time. When the first B-29 touched down, its massive shadow stretched across the island like a prophecy. From these runways would rise the bombers that would end the war. Captured Japanese soldiers at Tinian spoke of disbelief. One engineer said, "We took 2 months to extend our airfield by 1,000 meters. The Americans built 4 in a few weeks." He called it Oni no Kogyo, the work of demons. But it wasn't magic. It was logistics. Behind every Seabee was a factory, a ship, a nation. Steel planks were forged in Pittsburgh, crates of machinery packed in San Francisco, and shipped 12,000 miles across the ocean. When the Marines landed, the materials landed with them. To the Japanese, it looked like an army that created islands as it advanced. To the Seabees, it was just another project deadline. By November 1944, the first B-29 superfortresses lifted off from Saipan and Tinian. 111 aircraft thundered toward Tokyo. It was the first bombing of Japan's capital since Doolittle's raid 2 years earlier. The raid shocked the Japanese people, but they devastated the military planners even more. They realized too late that their entire Pacific defense system had been neutralized not by fleets or generals, but by builders. From this moment forward, the war was measured not in islands taken, but in runways completed. The Seabees had perfected a rhythm of war: land with the first wave, build while under fire, launch aircraft within days, move to the next island. Each campaign shortened the distance to Japan: Guadalcanal to Bougainville, Bougainville to Saipan, Saipan to Tinian, Tinian to Iwo Jima, Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Every island was a link in a chain forged by bulldozers and sweat. Every new base made the next invasion faster, safer, deadlier. This wasn't warfare in the traditional sense. It was assembly line conquest. In the Pacific, even the machines earned nicknames. Bulldozers were war elephants. Cranes were giraffes. Dump trucks were iron mules. To the Seabees, these machines were brothers. They protected them, repaired them, and buried them when they were destroyed. A bulldozer driver wrote home, "I trust this thing more than any gun. It's my weapon, my shelter, and my coffin if it goes wrong." In many ways, he was right. When shells fell, the men crouched behind their machines for cover. When the smoke cleared, they climbed back in and kept working. The bulldozer became the symbol of American determination, unstoppable, relentless, and deaf to fear. The Seabees were not faceless workers. They were fathers, husbands, craftsmen. They worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day. When rain turned airstrips into swamps, they worked barefoot, knee-deep in mud. They joked about dying of exhaustion before getting shot. They counted days by construction progress, not by the calendar. Every yard of concrete laid was a victory. One engineer summed it up simply: "We weren't trying to be heroes. We just didn't want Marines to die waiting for us to finish." By 1945, Japan's defensive line had completely collapsed. The Americans had built faster than the Japanese could react. Every time Japan reinforced one island, another behind them had already fallen and turned into an air base. It was the ultimate irony. Japan's obsession with defense had trapped them inside their own walls. Each island fortress became an American launch pad. A Japanese colonel called it the War of Construction, and it was one they could never win. What began as a miracle at Espiritu Santo had become the Seabees benchmark. 20 days. 20 days to build an airfield. 20 days to move from invasion to operational readiness. It became a doctrine, a symbol of industrial precision in the midst of chaos. Every time a Seabee officer radioed back to fleet headquarters, they gave the same promise, 20 days. And every time they delivered, the Seabees never appeared in the war headlines. There were no grand speeches, no parades for them. But behind every photograph of a bomber taking off, beneath every landing craft, beneath every pier, there were their fingerprints. They didn't conquer islands. They built the means to conquer them. And in that simple truth lies one of history's greatest paradoxes, that a war of destruction was won by men who created. As 1944 ended, the Pacific map told a clear story. The once distant American bases now formed a continuous chain, stretching from Hawaii to the doorstep of Japan. Every link was a Seabee creation. Every victory was laid in steel and concrete. Admiral Nimitz called it the greatest engineering feat in human history. The Japanese called it the death of distance. In truth, it was both. It was the moment when industry became geography, when the Americans no longer fought across the Pacific, but within it. In a letter to his family, a Seabee lieutenant wrote, "They will remember the battles. They will remember the generals, but not us. We are only the hands that turn the earth. Yet without hands, no war can stand." He was right. The Seabees never asked for glory. They only asked for the tools to finish the job and the time to do it, 20 days. That was all they needed to change the course of the Pacific War. The success at Saipan and Tinian gave the Allies something no one had thought possible 2 years earlier, a direct line of attack on the Japanese homeland. The next steps would be bloodier. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, islands where the ground itself seemed to resist. But now America knew it could win by building through fire. The Seabees would follow again into places where no builder should ever go, and prove once more that creation can be the sharpest weapon of all. Saipan, June 1944. The heat rose off the coral like steam from a forge. The air stank of fuel, gunpowder, and decay. Everywhere, twisted wreckage, cratered ground, bodies half buried in dust. And in the middle of it, the bulldozers moved, engines roaring, tracks clattering, men shouting through the noise. The Seabees worked as if the war itself were a deadline. Shirtless, covered in dust and blood, their hands blistered from shovels and wrenches. Overhead, the Japanese guns still fired from the hills. They didn't stop. Every shell that fell tore another crater, and every crater became another hole to fill. One officer wrote, "In the Pacific, you didn't win by killing faster. You won by building faster." It was true, and here, building meant surviving. There was no night on Saipan. Even when the sun went down, the island glowed. Fires from the fuel dumps, flares from the ships, and the yellow light of lanterns over the Seabee camps. They worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The roar of engines mixed with the thunder of distant guns. Sleep became a rumor. When shells hit close, they ducked behind bulldozers for cover. When the shelling stopped, they climbed back in and kept working. A mechanic later recalled, "We didn't even hear the explosions anymore. The only sound that mattered was the engine starting." To them, silence meant something had gone wrong. A machine had broken. A man had fallen. The construction never stopped because stopping meant death. By day, the Japanese artillery tried to destroy the airfields. By night, small squads slipped through the lines. 3, maybe 4 men at a time. Snipers, saboteurs, men who refused to surrender. They crawled through the darkness, shooting into work crews, planting mines on bulldozers. The Seabees learned to sleep with rifles beside their tools. A carpenter wrote, "We built in the daytime, fought in the night. By morning, we went back to building what they tried to blow up." At Tinian, a sniper's bullet killed a dozer driver mid-shift. His partner climbed into the seat and finished the job. Before even moving the body, By sunrise, the runway was another 100 feet longer. February 1944, Eniwetok Atoll, another speck of coral in the endless Pacific. When the Marines landed, the island erupted in gunfire. Japanese soldiers fought from underground bunkers. The air reeked of smoke and salt. The Seabees followed within hours. They unloaded tractors, rolled out drums of fuel, and began clearing ground, even as the last Japanese strongholds were still firing. For 10 days, the island burned. For 21 days, the Seabees worked, flattening coral, filling trenches, detonating unexploded bombs. When the final shot was fired, a 6,800-foot runway already stretched across the atoll. 17 Seabees died. 48 were wounded. But the airfield was ready before the island was secure. A Japanese survivor later said, "They built faster than we could die." November 1943, Tarawa, an island the size of a city park, 5,000 Japanese defenders, 2,000 Americans killed in 76 hours. When the last shot faded, the Seabees arrived. Bodies still lay across the beach. The ground was a graveyard of metal and flesh. Orders came from the fleet. "We need a runway by dawn." They cleared wreckage with cranes, filled shell holes with sandbags, and laid steel mats under the dim light of flares. 15 hours later, a fighter plane lifted off the new runway. A war correspondent wrote, "They turned a cemetery into an airfield." It was obscene. It was miraculous. It was war at industrial speed. For the men who survived, the war never really ended. They called it the Pacific Tremor, a shaking in their hands that never went away. Years later, they would still wake to the phantom sound of diesel engines and falling shells. A welder from Pennsylvania remembered, "I'd go to bed and still hear the bulldozer in my head. Sometimes I'd wake up and reach for a wrench." They built until the noise became part of them, until silence felt unnatural. It was the price of speed, the cost of surviving by never stopping. At Guam, a bulldozer hit a buried mine. The explosion tore the operator apart. His friends buried him beside the crater, then used another dozer to finish the job. They didn't cry. They didn't hold a ceremony. They just kept working. Later, one of them wrote, "The best thing we could do for him was keep the road open." They had no time for grief, because the war had no pause button. The machine replaced the man, and the mission replaced both. February 1945. A black, volcanic island, 8 square miles of ash and rock. 21,000 Japanese troops waited underground. For the Marines, it was a nightmare. For the Seabees, it was hell with a blueprint. They landed under fire with the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. Their orders, repair the captured airstrip for emergency use. While the battle still raged, artillery rained down from Mount Suribachi. Every load of gravel meant another risk. Every hour of delay meant another bomber lost at sea. By the 7th day, they had patched enough of the strip for small planes to land. By day 13, a crippled B-29 Superfortress from Saipan made an emergency landing. Its crew survived. By the end of the campaign, over 2,400 B-29s would land on Iwo Jima. More than 27,000 airmen owed their lives to those runways. The price, 40 Seabees dead, 150 wounded. They didn't win glory, but they saved lives that would have otherwise burned out over the Pacific. One captured Japanese engineer said later, "It took us 2 years to build a road up Mount Suribachi. The Americans built one in 2 weeks. I cried when I saw it, not from shame, from understanding." He finally realized what Japan was fighting against, a civilization that could recreate the world itself from wreckage. That realization broke something deeper than an army. It broke a nation's faith in its own limits. April 1945. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific. Okinawa, the gateway to Japan. Rain fell for 28 straight days. The ground turned to liquid mud. Japanese artillery pounded from the hills. Still, the Seabees built. They laid steel planks through the muck, erected piers that vanished under waves, constructed 2 full airfields, Yontan and Cadena, in 6 weeks. One bulldozer driver said, "We worked in the rain of God and the fire of the devil. When the sun came out, the runways were shining. The Japanese threw everything into the defense of Okinawa, including the kamikaze, the suicide pilots. They dove at ships like falling stars, crashing into transports, fuel ships, hospital vessels. On April 6th, a kamikaze struck the SS Logan Victory, a ship carrying 7,000 tons of ammunition. It exploded, killing 400 men and erasing the ship from existence. Yet within 36 hours, the Seabees had replaced the lost supplies, rebuilt the docks, and kept the invasion moving." A Japanese admiral watching from afar said, "We destroyed them by night, and by morning they were whole again." He never realized he wasn't fighting men anymore. He was fighting a system. They didn't get parades or medals. They didn't have aces or famous heroes. They were the silent ones behind the front line. Men who built while others fought. Some died crushed by machinery. Some died digging in the rain. Many simply vanished, their graves lost under concrete they laid themselves. When the war ended, they went home quietly, to farms, to factories, to families who never knew what they had endured. But their work didn't vanish. The runways, docks, and bridges they built still scar the islands today. Their ghosts live beneath the asphalt. Japan had built an army of warriors. America had built an army of builders. And that, more than any weapon, decided the war. A single Seabee battalion of 1,100 men could build a 2-kilometer airstrip in 20 days, a hospital in 10, and a full harbor in 4. By 1945, over 325,000 Seabees were scattered across the Pacific. 400 bases, 111 airfields, hundreds of docks, roads, depots. The Pacific War had become a production line, and every man who died was replaced by another, flown in from a factory thousands of miles away. It was war as industry, the transformation of chaos into order at mechanical speed. In the ruins of Okinawa, Colonel Yahara Hirami, one of Japan's last strategists, wrote in his diary, "Every island lost becomes the enemy's base. We cannot defend faster than they build." He understood what few others did, that the empire wasn't losing territory. It was losing time. Every day the Seabees worked, Japan's future shrank by another 24 hours. By the summer of 1945, Tokyo's generals no longer planned victories. They only calculated delays. Amid the noise and the machinery, there was still humanity, a flicker of compassion beneath the grime. A Seabee foreman recalled finding a wounded Japanese soldier, hiding near the construction site. He gave him water, bandaged his arm, and told him quietly, "We build, we don't kill." Hours later, artillery killed them both. He wasn't wrong. The Seabees' mission was not destruction. It was creation, even in the heart of death. The Seabees lived in contradiction. They were soldiers, but not killers. They built peace through the tools of war. They existed between destruction and creation, between the roar of engines and the silence of graves. In every photograph, they seem indifferent, faces streaked with oil, eyes empty with exhaustion. But beneath that emptiness was resolve. They knew what they were building was more than runways. They were building the road to the end. At night, the Pacific wind carried 3 sounds: waves, engines, and hammers. Together, they became the rhythm of the Seabees' war. When Marines heard the engines behind them, they knew they'd hold the island. When Japanese scouts heard them, they knew the island was already lost. That sound, the growl of the dozer, the clatter of steel, was the anthem of America's advance. A colonel once said, "When you hear the bulldozers, it means civilization is winning." The Seabees didn't measure success by lives taken, but by feet of runway completed. Yet each foot came with its own blood. They buried their dead beside their machines. They used their helmets as shovels, their tears mixing with coral dust. But they kept going because the next plane, the next supply ship, the next victory depended on them. In the Pacific, creation was no less cruel than destruction. After Saipan, after Tinian, after Okinawa, the Seabees no longer feared death. They feared stopping. Stopping meant silence, and silence meant the war was over. And they would have to remember everything they had built and everything they had lost. One man wrote simply, "Hell wasn't the fire. Hell was the work that never ended, and for them, it never truly did." By mid-1945, the Pacific was no longer an ocean. It was an assembly line. From the Solomons to the Marianas, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, a chain of airfields, ports, and bases stretched like a man-made spine across the sea. For Japan, it was the end. For America, it was momentum. A war driven by numbers, machines, and men who never stopped building. The Seabees had done the impossible. They had built faster than the enemy could destroy. And in doing so, they had turned the Pacific, once a barrier, into a highway of steel. From these bases would come the final storms. And from the islands they built, the last shadow of war would rise. In 1945, the Seabees stood at the height of their power. They had become the backbone of the Allied advance. On Guam, they built a harbor big enough to house an entire fleet. At Ulithi Atoll, they constructed a floating city. Piers stretching 15 kilometers, storage tanks for 300 million gallons of fuel, and repair docks large enough for battleships. At night, the anchorage of Ulithi glowed like Manhattan on the water. 700 ships floated there. A navy fed, repaired, and sustained by the hands of men who once built bridges back home. A sailor wrote in his log, "We live in a city without streets, and everything around us was made by men who never stopped moving." The Pacific had become a living machine. Every island, a gear. Every Seabee, a tooth in its wheel. August 6, 1945, Tinian Island, the same island where the Seabees had carved 4 runways out of coral and ash the year before. The night was silent. On the airfield, mechanics checked 2 massive B-29s, Enola Gay and Boxcar. Inside their bomb bays rested weapons unlike anything the world had seen. The Seabees on duty didn't know the details. They only knew that something enormous was happening. Their job was to maintain the runways, clear the taxiways, and make sure the machines could fly. At 2:45 a.m., Enola Gay began to roll. The engines roared. The steel plates under the tires shuddered. It lifted off into the darkness. 3 hours later, over Hiroshima, the light of a new age was born. White, blinding, absolute. When the news reached Tinian, the men were silent. They had been working, repairing the airfield, clearing debris. Then a voice came over the radio. Hiroshima destroyed. No one cheered, no one spoke. A Seabee electrician remembered, "We looked at each other and didn't say a word. We just kept working. We had built the runway, but we didn't know what would take off from it." They had fought for 2.5 years to create speed, efficiency, and reach. And now that speed had ended the war with a single unbearable flash. One officer wrote in his diary, "We built so the war could end sooner, but I never thought ending could look like that." September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. A gray morning under a quiet sky. The battleship USS Missouri stood anchored among hundreds of American ships. On its deck, General Douglas MacArthur read the terms of surrender. Behind him, admirals from every allied nation. Below them, the Seabees' work, harbors, piers, and airfields that had made this moment possible. Far to the south on Saipan, the Seabees listened to the news over a rusted radio. No celebration, just a long exhale. They didn't cheer because they were too tired to feel victory. They had built every step that led here. And now they finally stopped. The war ended, but the engines didn't stop immediately. There were still docks to finish, hospitals to build for the wounded, graves to dig for the dead. When it was finally over, the Seabees parked their bulldozers in neat rows, covered them with tarps, and walked away. One of them wrote, "The sound of engines had been our heartbeat. When it stopped, the silence was deafening. For the first time in years, the Pacific was still. 325,000 Seabees served during the war. When peace came, they went home quietly. There were no parades, no fanfare. They returned to their old lives. Carpenters, electricians, welders, road builders. Many never spoke about what they'd seen. How do you explain to your family that you built runways through corpses or welded steel while bombs fell around you?" They left the war behind, but the war never truly left them. A veteran said years later, "I can't remember faces anymore. I only remember the smell of hot steel and diesel. Though the men faded into memory, their work remained. The airfields of Saipan and Tinian became civilian airports. The docks of Guam still handle ships. The roads they carved through the jungle became highways. What they built out of desperation became the skeleton of the modern Pacific." Admiral Nimitz said it best, "The Seabees built the path to victory. And in doing so, they built the foundations of peace. The war ended, but their creation endured. Every plane that flies from the Marianas today takes off from the same runways they once forged under fire. The 20-day Airfield, the symbol of American efficiency, had a price no one calculated. Every rush, every shortcut, every sleepless night took something from the men who made it. They gave their backs, their sanity, their years." A Seabee wrote home, "They talk about the miracle of speed, but speed costs something. It costs the piece of you that knows how to rest. Even in peacetime, many couldn't stop moving. They built barns, sheds, bridges, anything, because motion was the only way to keep the memories from catching up." In the ruins of post-war Japan, engineers studied the wreckage and took notes. They learned the lessons the Seabees had taught through fire: efficiency, logistics, adaptability. Men like A.G. Toyota, who would later lead Toyota, spoke of being inspired by America's wartime precision. 2 decades later, Japan rebuilt itself using the same ideas that once destroyed it. History had come full circle. The builders of one war had unknowingly laid the foundation for the next era of peace. An era powered not by weapons, but by industry. World War II was never just a clash of armies. It was a clash of philosophies. Japan believed war was an act of spirit, won through sacrifice, loyalty, and purity of purpose. America believed it was an act of organization, won through systems, machines, and time. One sought glory in death, the other sought purpose in work. In the end, the machine outlasted the sword. Efficiency defeated faith. And yet, the men who built that efficiency never glorified it. They knew what it had cost. The Seabees lived a contradiction. They built to end war, but their creations also made war more deadly. They created bases that launched the planes that burned cities. They built peace by perfecting destruction. It's a paradox that no general, no historian could ever untangle. A Seabee chaplain once said, "They built roads through hell and prayed someone else would walk them toward heaven." The Seabees were the embodiment of a new kind of soldier, not conquerors but constructors. Their victory came not from what they destroyed, but from what they created. They carried wrenches instead of swords, blueprints instead of battle plans. They proved that civilization itself could be weaponized. Every island they touched became an extension of America's will. Not through conquest, but through construction. And in that, the Pacific War became something larger than strategy. It became a statement that the modern world would be built by those who could create order out of chaos. Years after the war, historians would write about the battles. Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they'd name generals, admirals, and heroes. But in the margins, there would always be a few words: runway completed in 20 days. Pier constructed under fire. Those simple lines, those numbers without emotion, were the true measure of the Pacific Campaign. They were proof that human will, when armed with machines and purpose, could reshape the Earth itself. In late 1945, a group of Seabees remained on Tinian to dismantle surplus equipment. Every evening, they watched the sun set over the empty runways. One of them wrote, "It's strange. We spent years building so planes could take off. Now I miss the sound." When they left, they planted a small sign near the airfield fence. It read, "We built, we fought, we finished." No monument, no statue. Just words carved into wood, left to the wind. In the end, the 20-day airfield was more than a number. It was a symbol of human capability. The ability to adapt, to endure, to create under pressure. For Japan, it marked the moment they realized they could not win. For America, it marked the moment they understood what they were capable of. And for the Seabees, it marked the moment when ordinary men discovered they could move mountains if they didn't stop to count the cost. Decades later, if you walk across the old runways of Saipan or Tinian, you can still see the steel plates rusting beneath the asphalt. You can still feel the hum of history under your feet. Listen closely. You might hear the ghosts of engines, the clang of hammers, the rhythm of men who built through hell. They weren't chasing glory. They were racing time. And in 20 days, they built not only the runways that ended a war, but the bridge between destruction and peace.